Before there was a United States, before skyscrapers and highways and the language of freedom that would one day echo across the world, there were ships crossing the Atlantic Ocean, carrying human beings in chains. The story of how Black Americans ended up in America begins long before America existed as a country. It begins in West and Central Africa, in thriving kingdoms, villages, trading cities, and farming communities. People lived complex lives. They were farmers, blacksmiths, mothers, warriors, scholars, and storytellers. They spoke many languages and practiced different religions. They belonged to nations with histories stretching back centuries. At the same time, European powers were expanding across the globe. Countries like Portugal, Spain, England, France, and the Netherlands were building overseas empires. They claimed land in the Americas and established plantations to grow crops such as sugar, tobacco, rice, and later cotton. These crops generated enormous wealth, but they required intense labor. Indigenous populations in the Americas had been devastated by disease and violence after European contact. European settlers first relied in part on indentured servants, but plantation owners increasingly turned to enslaved Africans. A brutal trade system developed across the Atlantic. European traders exchanged goods for captured Africans, who were then forced onto ships and transported to the Americas. This vast forced movement of people became known as the Transatlantic slave trade. In 1619, a ship arrived at Jamestown carrying Africans who had been seized from a Portuguese slave ship. That moment is often marked as the beginning of African presence in English North America. At first, the system was not yet fully defined. Some Africans in the early colonies eventually gained freedom. But over time, colonial laws hardened. Race became tied to permanent hereditary slavery. Being Black increasingly meant being enslaved for life, and children born to enslaved women automatically inherited that status. The journey across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, was horrifying. Captured Africans were packed tightly into ships, chained together with little room to move. Many died from disease, starvation, or abuse. Families were torn apart before they even reached the shore. Those who survived arrived in a land they did not know, surrounded by a language they did not understand, forced into labor under threat of violence. As the colonies grew, slavery became central to their economy. Tobacco plantations in Virginia and Maryland expanded. Rice fields in South Carolina demanded backbreaking work. After the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, cotton production exploded across the Deep South. Enslaved labor powered this growth. By the time the United States declared independence in 1776, slavery was already deeply embedded in its foundation. This contradiction was impossible to ignore. A new nation proclaimed that all men are created equal, yet millions were held as property. Over the decades, tensions over slavery intensified. Some Americans called for abolition, arguing that slavery was morally wrong and incompatible with democracy. Others defended it as essential to their economy and way of life. In 1861, these tensions erupted into the American Civil War. The conflict between the northern and southern states became a turning point. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in Confederate states to be free. 2 years later, the 13th Amendment formally abolished slavery throughout the country. Freedom, however, did not bring immediate equality. During the Reconstruction era, formerly enslaved men briefly held political office, voted, and built schools and churches. There was hope, but that hope was met with fierce resistance. White supremacist groups used terror to intimidate Black communities. Southern states passed laws that segregated public spaces and stripped Black citizens of voting rights. These Jim Crow laws enforced racial separation and inequality for nearly a century. Violence and discrimination pushed many Black families to make a new journey. Beginning around 1916, millions left the rural South in what became known as the Great Migration. They boarded trains heading north and west, searching for factory jobs and safer lives in cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York, and Los Angeles. They carried little with them except determination and dreams of dignity. In these cities, they faced new forms of discrimination, but they also built vibrant neighborhoods and cultural movements. Music transformed. Jazz, blues, and later rhythm and blues and hip hop reshaped global culture. Writers, artists, and intellectuals told new stories about Black identity and American life. Despite barriers, Black Americans continued to redefine the nation. By the mid 20th century, a new generation refused to accept segregation as permanent. The civil rights movement gathered strength. Activists organized boycotts, marches, and sit ins. One of its most visible leaders was Martin Luther King Jr., who called for nonviolent resistance and racial justice. Protesters faced arrests, beatings, and even death. Yet their persistence led to landmark legislation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed segregation in public spaces. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 protected the right to vote. While much of this story centers on descendants of enslaved Africans, the Black population in the United States continued to evolve. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, immigrants from African and Caribbean nations began arriving in greater numbers. They came voluntarily, seeking education, work, and opportunity. They added new layers of language, religion, and tradition to the broader Black American experience. So how did Black Americans end up in America? For most, the answer begins with force. Their ancestors were taken against their will, transported across an ocean in chains, and compelled to build a nation that denied them freedom. But the story does not end with victimhood. It continues through centuries of endurance, resistance, migration, creativity, and political struggle. What began as a system designed to exploit human beings gave rise to communities that transformed the United States in profound ways. Black Americans helped build its economy through enslaved labor. They expanded its democracy by demanding civil rights. They shaped its culture in music, language, art, sports, and faith. Their presence in America is not a footnote. It is central to the American story. It is a story born in injustice, but carried forward by resilience. And it continues to unfold today.